Hello there, and welcome to the History of Ælfwine. You might have wondered where my profile name comes from and how it fits in with a Tolkien theme. Well, by the end of this video, you will certainly know who Ælfwine is, where he fits in with Tolkien's Legendarium, and which writings he appears in. All the sources that I use come from the 12-volume book series The History of Middle-earth, compiled and edited by Tolkien's son Christopher in the 1980s and 90s. I will go through each book in which Ælfwine is mentioned, discuss the pieces in which he shows up, and share some of the text, prose, and poetry with you. So, without further ado, let's get started. The first book containing the Ælfwine story is called The Book of Lost Tales, Part 1. There are two parts. Now, Tolkien began writing these tales in 1916 during World War I when he was 25 years old, but he left them incomplete several years later. The Silmarillion, as we know it, evolved from these very stories. And if you read them, you will certainly recognize what you read in the Silmarillion, except some names will be different and events, of course, will vary widely as well. Now, when you read the Silmarillion, it's just presented to you as is, in the third-person, omniscient narrator voice. But what if Tolkien originally meant for there to be a different way of presenting his mythology of the elder days? Christopher writes, "It is certainly debatable whether it was wise to publish a 1977 version of the primary legendarium standing on its own and claiming, as it were, to be self-explanatory. The published work has no framework, no suggestion of what it is and how, within the imagined world, it came to be. This I now think to have been an error." Framework? What's he talking about? Well, he means a framing device used as a literary aid, a character who records all the legends that we read when we open the book. So it's as though Tolkien didn't write the legendarium, but rather we receive it through an intermediary character, like how Bilbo is meant to be the author of The Hobbit, and Frodo is the author of The Lord of the Rings. But let's take a closer look at this framework for the legends. The Book of Lost Tales, Part 1, begins, "Now it happened of a certain time that a traveller from far countries, a man of great curiosity, was by desire of strange lands and the ways and dwellings of unaccustomed folk, brought in a ship as far west even as the lonely island, Deladerrière, in the fairy speech." Who is this traveller? Well, he is introduced by the name Eärl, meaning one who dreams alone. In the narrative, he goes to a place called the Cottage of Lost Play, a house where a number of elves live. They invite him in, and one by one tell him the history of Arda, basically the Silmarillion. Okay, so who is Eärl in these early Lost Tale stories? Tolkien writes about his origins in a bunch of jumbled notes independent of the Lost Tales. Apparently, it's only the elves who call him Eärl, but his real name is Ottor Wafra, the latter name being an Old English word for wandering. And he's a sailor from the historic homeland of the Anglo-Saxons, that is, Denmark, northern Germany. When Ottor's brother kills their father, Ottor leaves their land and settles in Heligoland, an archipelago off the coast of northern Germany. He gets married and has two sons, Hengist and Horsa. Now, some of you may know that in reality, Hengist and Horsa are traditionally known as the men who led the Anglo-Saxon conquering of Britain in the 5th century. Anyway, the sea-longing grips Ottor, and after his wife dies, he sets out west to seek Deladerrière, leaving behind his two sons. Once he gets there, he is called Eärl by the elves, and they tell him the history of Arda. He eventually settles there and marries again, and he has a son called Heorenda. Now, either Eärl or his son Heorenda compiles all of the writings about the elves in a book called The Golden Book of Tavrobel. Eärl dies on Deladerrière. Now, in the Book of Lost Tales, the story of the elves is actually not over with Eärl recording their history. In fact, when he's still alive, there's a battle between elves who don't yet live in the Undying Lands and the servants of Melkor. Deladerrière is dragged east over the sea in the now geographical spot known as England, so that the Eressian elves can help their brethren out. But the elves are defeated, retreat to the island, evil men invade the island, there's a big battle, and Eärl witnesses it before he finishes his book. The elves then fade from the sight of men, and Ariel's 3 sons come and conquer the island from the evil men. They are not hostile to the elves, and so they receive the tradition of the fairies, as laid out in the golden book that Ariel wrote. Christopher states that the story of Ariel the mariner was central to my father's original conception of the mythology. The primary intention of his work was to satisfy his desire for a specifically and recognizably English literature of fairy. Okay, so that was Tolkien's earliest idea for making a mythology of England. Ariel recording elven history, which is tied up with English history. Kind of interesting, right? But Ariel and the Book of Lost Tales do not stick around for long, and certainly the stories evolve and change over the decades following the 1910s. Let's go to the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. A little later on, Tolkien wrote a scheme for a new revised conception of the Lost Tales, in which a character called Ælfwine, not Ariel, is a mariner who visits the Lonely Island. Ælfwine means elf friend. Now in this version, Deladerrière is no longer supposed to be England, because Ælfwine himself is from 11th century Wessex, and he comes to the island and learns and records elvish history after all the events of the Elder Days, and there's no invasion of evil men or moving around of the island or anything like that. The notes end with him writing the Golden Book of Tavrobel. But then in the early 1920s, Tolkien wrote a short, unfinished narrative about Ælfwine in which his history is told. Yet again, it's a different story, and it ends just as he arrives at the Lonely Isle. Let's take a look at it, shall we? When Ælfwine is a boy, his mother dies, and his father is killed during an attack on their city by evil men of the north. They make him a thrall, and his boyhood knew evil days. But behold a wonder, for Ælfwine knew not and had never seen the sea, yet he heard its great voice speaking deeply in his heart, that he was filled with longing. He's also able to converse with the elves who still live in England and haven't passed over the sea yet. He's a friend of the elves, unlike the evil men who encroach on their land. Many of these elves are actually barely visible. Eventually, the sea longing grows so much in him that he escapes and goes to the southwest of England where he can see the great ocean. Yet even in the days of Ælfwine, there was many a laden ship under elfin sails that left those shores forever, and many a comrade he had, seen or half unseen, upon his westward road. He asks to go with them, but they say no, for they were not willing that even one beloved among men should pass with them beyond the edge of the west. So he takes up his abode with the fishermen of that region, and he learns everything there is to know about seamanship and sailing. He's determined to reach the magic islands of the elves, so he gathers a crew and they set out. But a storm wrecks their ship, and Ælfwine wakes up on a beach with no one in sight. And he knows he hasn't reached the islands he wanted to. He sees a bunch of wrecked ships there, and comes across a cabin made of an upturned hull. An ancient man dwelt there, and Ælfwine feared him, for the eyes of the man were as deep as the unfathomable sea. The old man tells him that the Lonely Isle is still far off. He helps Ælfwine get to a different island where a seafaring people live, and there he comes across his lost crew members. The islanders build them a ship, the old man bids them farewell, and they set off again. They're at sea for many years until one day, when they almost give up, they suddenly smell a sweet fragrance in the night. Then they see many lights far off and realize that they've come near the Lonely Island. Then came their music very gently over the waters, and it was laden with unimagined longing. And the men try to get closer in their rowboat, only to have mists cover the moon, stars, and the water before them. Then they can't see or hear anything. Ælfwine leans forward and jumps into the sea, but his crew never see him again, and they go back to England. This is where the narrative ends. Darn. Now on to the third book in the series, The Shaping of Middle-earth. The next bit of writing that Tolkien did on the Silmarillion is a sketch of the plot that he wrote for a former teacher in 1926. This sketch or outline does not mention either Ariel or Ælfwine. The subsequent iteration of the Silmarillion is called the Quenta, and Tolkien wrote it in the 1930s. Ariel not only appears in the title, but right at the end with this quotation. Ariel, who alone of the mortals of later days, and yet now long ago, sailed to the lonely isle, and came back, and remembered things that he had heard in Deladerrière. Tolkien even wrote a fragment of the Quenta in Old English, and he states that it was written by Ælfwine of England, whom the elves call Eärol. Sections of two other pieces of writing that Tolkien wrote in Old English in the voice of Ælfwine are timelines called the Annals of Valinor and the Annals of Bodleian. They were most likely written in the 1930s. The Annals of Valinor open by stating that they were written originally by an elf of Gondolin called Pengololth the Wise, and that Ælfwine simply translated them into Old English. This is the first time we see this elf Pengololth mentioned. Keep him in mind for later. He shows up again. On to the fourth book, The Lost Road and Other Writings. Now, as we all know, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were good friends, and at one point in time, they had challenged each other to write novels. Lewis would write a space travel novel, and Tolkien would write a time travel novel. But he never finished it. It was to be called The Lost Road. He even submitted the finished part of it to Allen and Unwin in 1937. It was basically an excuse for him to write his own version of the Atlantis myth, that is, the downfall of Numenor, which he later just incorporated into his mythology. The main gist is that there are various father-son duos throughout time whose ancestry can all be traced back to Amandil and Elendil of Numenor. The Anglo-Saxon time frame father-son pair would be Ælfwine and Eadwine from the year 918 AD. Their chapters, however, were never actually written. We only get a glimpse of Ælfwine's background through some notes. The first note says it would be best to have Ælfwine in an introduction to the Lost Tales. How Ælfwine sailed the straight road. They sailed on over the sea, and it became very bright and very calm. No clouds, no wind. The water seemed thin and white below. Looking down, Ælfwine suddenly saw lands and mountains down in the water, shining in the sun. Their breathing difficulties. His companions dive overboard one by one. Ælfwine falls insensible when he smells a marvelous fragrance as of land and flowers. He awakes to find the ship being drawn by people walking in the water. He is told very few men there in 1,000 years can breathe air of Eärethsea, but none beyond. So he comes to Eärethsea and is told the Lost Tales. End of note. Isn't that lovely? Another note states that he and his son live in the time of Edward the Elder in North Somerset. Ælfwine is ruined by Danish raids. If you recall your British history, this is the time when the Vikings have been attacking England. The scene opens with an attack on Porlock in 915 AD. The father and son have a conversation about how they're sick of these incursions. Eadwine says they should have some sense and go west to escape, but Ælfwine objects and says, "Paradise cannot be got to by ship. There are deeper waters between us and the ocean. Roads are bent." Roads are bent. Keep that visual in mind. They decide to go anyway with 10 companions, pursued by Vikings. They fall into a delirium, and the notes end here. Ugh, so frustrating. And yet another note is the beginning of an actual narrative that breaks off very abruptly. It shows Ælfwine as a minstrel in the court of King Edward, where he sings about longing to journey over sea. Now here it's hinted that he has already been to lands far in the west. Now, this unfinished novel, The Lost Road, and the accompanying notes are really fascinating. But unfortunately, Tolkien had to set them aside in order to work on The Lord of the Rings. In 1945, before The Lord of the Rings was completed, he did revisit Ælfwine yet again in a piece of writing called the Notion Club Papers, which I will talk about momentarily. But first, a poem written around the same time as The Lost Road. It's titled The Song of Ælfwine, and it is accompanied by a short note explaining who he is, that he's a seaman of England of old who passes into the deep waters of the west and finds the straight road coming to Deladerrière. Or maybe he just falls into a trance and visits it in a vision or dream. And when he comes back to his own lands, he spends the rest of his life sailing and searching for the Lonely Isle. And the last thing he says before his final voyage, Many things there be in the west regions unknown to men, many wonders and many creatures, a land lovely to behold, the homeland of the elves and the bliss of the Valar. Little doth any man understand what the yearning may be of one whom old age cutteth off from returning thither. I'll read to you the last stanza of the poem as well. I think it's quite lovely. O shore beyond the shadowy sea, O land where still the Eðil are, O haven where my heart would be, the waves still beat upon thy bar. The white birds wheel, their flowers the tree, again I glimpse them long afar, when rising west of west I see, beyond the world the wayward star, than beacons bright in Gondobar, more fair and keen, more clear and high. O star that shadow may not mar, nor ever darkness doomed to die. Now let's turn to a later version of the music of the Ainur, written in the 1930s. An elf called Rúmil tells this piece to Ariel in the Lost Tales, and he does so again to Ælfwine in this later version. Rúmil, as you may remember from the published Silmarillion, is the first person to invent writing. And yet another piece of writing, called the Lammas, or Account of Tongues, is what Pengolóð tells to Ælfwine. This piece just explains all the languages of the elves. Pengolóð also tells Ælfwine the Silmarillion proper. Now, this version of the Legendarium is more developed than the earlier sketch, and it was submitted to Allen and Unwin in 1937, along with The Lost Road. It contains a preamble supposedly written by Ælfwine. These histories were written by Pengolóð the Wise of Gondolin, both in that city before its fall and afterwards at Tathrobel in the Lonely Isle, Deladerrière, after the return unto the west. In their making, he used much the writings of Rúmil, the elf sage of Valinor, chiefly in the Annals of Valinor and the Account of Tongues, and he used also the accounts that are preserved in the Golden Book. The work of Pengolóð I learned much by heart, and turned into my tongue, some during my sojourn in the West, but most after my return to Britain. Let's skip ahead to the 9th book in the series, Sauron Defeated. Earlier, I briefly mentioned a piece of writing called the Notion Club Papers. This is an abandoned novel that includes time travel and dreams, kind of like The Lost Road. It centers around the minutes for the meetings of a fictional arts discussion club, not unlike Tolkien's own club, the Inklings. The Notion Club, the Inklings, get it? During one of the meetings, one of the club members discusses a vivid dream he has in which he is an Anglo-Saxon man called Ælfwine. The dream actually resembles what we've already seen in the notes that accompany The Lost Road, except we get a lot more detail here. So here's the dream. Ælfwine is daydreaming in the court of King Edward the Elder in Porlock. He's thinking about his father, Eadwine, not his son this time, and the strange tales he had told me when I was a small lad, tales of the west coasts and far islands, and of the deep sea, and of a land there was far away, where there was peace and fruitfulness among the fair folk that did not wither. The men call out for a minstrel, and when Ælfwine starts to sing of sea longing, some of them laugh because they know he's obsessed with the ocean and all things sailing. His friend Treowine is also there, and he sings an enchanting song of the sea as well. The Danes attack Porlock later that night, and one of their small boats is captured. Ælfwine and Treowine find a couple men, and they take the boat and start sailing west. They sail on until a dreamlike death seems to overtake them, and they smell a sweet fragrance in the air. Great clouds like eagles come out of the west, and Treowine sees the round world curve below, and straight ahead a shining land. A note states that Ælfwine sees the Book of Stories and writes down what he can remember from it. Then he has fleeting visions, and the note ends there. Now on to the 10th book, Morgoth's Ring. These tales are feigned to be translated from the preserved work of Ælfwine of England, circa 900 AD, who, being blown west from Ireland, eventually came upon the straight road and found the lonely isle, Deladerrière, beyond the seas. There he learned ancient lore and brought back translations and excerpts from works of elvish lore. That quotation is from a letter that Tolkien wrote, and I think it's a nice little summary of what Ælfwine is really all about. Now, this book, Morgoth's Ring, contains what Christopher Tolkien refers to as the later Quenta Silmarillion. Later, because it was written after The Lord of the Rings. It also has a later version of the Ainulindale, which was actually written during the writing of The Lord of the Rings. The foreword to it states, "This was made by Rumil of Tuna in the elder days. It is here written as it was spoken in Eressëa to Ælfwine by Pengolodh the sage. To it are added the further words that Pengolodh spoke at that time concerning the Valar, the Eldar, and the Etani, of which more is said hereafter." Ah, okay, now it's not Rumil who tells it to Ælfwine, but Pengolodh. We also see a later version of the Annals of Valinor, here referred to as the Annals of Aman, written by Rumil. There's no title page or preamble for Quenta Silmarillion regarding Pengolodh or Ælfwine. However, we know that Pengolodh is telling it to Ælfwine because throughout the text it occasionally will say, quoth Pengolodh, or so spake Ælfwine, things like that. There's an interesting essay called Laws and Customs Among the Eldar, and it has a preamble written by Ælfwine, which is interesting because it's written from a human's point of view, like Ælfwine is a sort of anthropologist telling us about these people called elves. The stuff we see in this book is all really cool because it shows that the Ælfwine framing device lasted a long time in Tolkien's mind regarding the conception of the mythology. In the penultimate book in the series, The War of the Jewels, there's an introductory note that Ælfwine writes to the Narnichin Húrin, which basically just introduces the story. In it, he states that he has not made any changes to it, except on matters that seemed of interest, or that were become dark with the passing of the years. I have made notes, whether within the tale or upon its margins, according to such lore as I found in Eressëa. And that's all we see in this book regarding Ælfwine. And now, the last book in the series, The Peoples of Middle-earth. There's an essay titled Dangweth Pengolodh, or The Answer of Pengolodh to Ælfwine, who asked him how came it that the tongues of the elves changed and were sundered. That's pretty much all there is to that piece in terms of Ælfwine's involvement. And now, the Akallabeth was originally meant to have Pengolodh tell it to Ælfwine, but Christopher omitted that in the published Silmarillion. In fact, the original ending text after the conclusion of the story goes as follows. "And whether all these tales be feigned, or whether some at least be true, and by them the Valar still keep a light among men a memory beyond the darkness of Middle-earth, thou knowest now, Ælfwine, in thyself, yet haply none shall believe thee." Indeed. I wonder what old Ælfwine's countrymen thought when he brought back all these tales. So why would Christopher Tolkien choose to omit all mention of this Anglo-Saxon mariner from the published Silmarillion? After all, we see him present throughout all the various iterations of the mythology, albeit less and less as time goes on. Well, let's go back to the foreword of the Book of Lost Tales Part 1. In it, Christopher states that the original character of Eärl was much more narratively involved than his later iteration Ælfwine, and that by the latest writings on the Silmarillion, Ælfwine had all but fallen away completely, becoming somewhat unnecessary. He says of his father's probable intentions at the end, "He concluded that nothing would serve, and no more would be said beyond an explanation of how, within the imagined world, it came to be recorded." Besides, Christopher says it can be assumed that we get all the stories from Bilbo's studies in Rivendell preserved in the Red Book of Westmarch. Additionally, since Tolkien never made a definitive statement on whether or not to keep Ælfwine, Christopher did not want to make that decision for him. So there you have it. Even though we don't have a single definitive story of Ælfwine, at least you now have the impression of who he is and what his road is all about.